this. Cool. So yeah, first ever dev call. This is going to be fun. So hopefully everyone has the agenda. It's on this HackMD. So I think we're going to really quickly just go through like basically introduce the call format, check in on some of the goals of the project, and then like I'd like to sort of take some time to discuss like just this RFC process and how that might work in relation to user experience. So I think every call should sort of work like this. I think we should basically have some section of like, hello, hi, nice to see you. Anybody new? Anybody have any questions? And then just like move into a check-in that is more oriented toward like just goals, like tracking, mainly just sort of trying to burn down issues. I think a lot of the issues should be created in advance in async. And so this project should just, or this part should just literally be like, hey, how are we doing on this? How are we doing on that? And if you want a chance to like chat with everybody on a specific like issue or thing that needs to get cleaned up or fixed or addressed, you can throw that on the agenda beforehand and that'll make sure that it gets discussed. To me, I think it's important that we have like some time and space to like work through some of these things directly. And so today it's as the first call, like we already do have a whole bunch of stuff going on that I think is worth sort of looking into. And the first bit is obviously, and so we can just go into that. But I'm hoping that this won't always take the full hour. It'd be nice if just like, if there isn't a ton to check in on, then we're good. But if it needs the full hour, then we'll use it. But I sort of want to keep the goal check-in process pretty like bullet pointy. And then the actual like save some room for the discussion. That being said, like if we need time to work through an issue, then we need time to work through an issue. So speaking on project check-ins, we have a couple of things that are going on. I think the biggest one is obviously just getting the 0.8 out the door, which is like coming along. I think we're technically like 2 weeks behind according to the GitHub milestone due date. Which we should try and like observe, but I'm not too worried about it. On this release, I've sort of want to get in the habit of putting the draft release notes in a tracking issue so that we can sort of look through it beforehand. And so I've started doing that, and I think I have one major question for everybody before we move on, which is basically if you take a quick look at the high level of so here I'll link to the issue that I'm talking about. That has the description of, so this should have the description in that top comment of this like draft release notes. And so everything below this should basically, I just want to start collecting up stuff that we should be talking about in the release as it's coming out. So yeah, I want to make sure that we're not missing anything major. And so from my perspective, looking through the changelog, we have basically auto update stuff, like all of our update service things. I think we can flesh out some of those details a little more. But we've got like two big things in Starlark, the beautiful soup package and that pretty crucial change to dataset where you now get the prior version passed in. I think that needs to be called out pretty heavily because it's not a breaking API change because you used to get nothing and now you get something. So it's like a forward compatible change, but it's a pretty important one for like, and also like demonstrating append-only lists and stuff. And then the other two biggies in my mind are like, basically the CLI now uses the pager variable and environment variable and actually does a lot of that. I think that's a good chance to also just call it the fact that we've spent a whole bunch of time cleaning up output and making it prettier. And then, and then our switch to go modules, which I think should be outlined here and is one of the sort of like bigger low level shifts to the project, but it affects every make script and build script. And so I think that's the last major thing that's sort of hanging out in the open before we ship this. Does anything strike anyone as like missing? It's like major that we've done since 0.7. whatever.
I feel like there's a lot of small fixes to polish, but they don't have to be included.
Yeah, I think that's I think it's worth like checking in on that. And so like you can obviously the make change log. I read through it and a lot of it looks tiny and worth like, but we should check when we actually submit the release PR. And I think the other bit is like sort of coming back to the agenda. I'm hoping that we would be a little more rigorous with our releases where we like actually sit down with our release and go, okay, cool. Does this thing do the things that we said it's going to do. Okay, we have this new automatic updates feature. Before we actually cut that release, let's make sure that it functions and works the way that it's intended, and it's not just going out the door because it's in a semi-acceptable state, right? And I think I just want to try and use our releases as, particularly the 0.8 release, where we're going to be building a lot of things on top of it, and we're going to like really be using it in a number of ways. So I think it's worth like really digging in and being more rigorous around release, the release checkmark process. Like I think we've been very much in like a move fast and cut releases sort of mode for a while, and I think it's now time to sort of slow down and go, okay, before we cut this thing, let's like make sure this release is good and to our liking. Yeah, so I wanted to call that out. Looking over to what else do we have? Yeah, so I think that's 0.8. I mean, we can go through the features, but I mean, ideally the release notes should cover those. And that's sort of, yeah, and that last point is already covered. Like, I just think that we should, so the long term for this is I'm really hoping that we can start with the query team being a little more rigorous about the releases, but then eventually shifting that over to somebody else and saying, cool, are you willing to be like a designated peer reviewer on this release? And so somebody who would come in from the outside and say, look at our changelog, take a new version of query, and they're already familiar with query, and then play with it and go, okay, cool, I approve this release, and have that be part of our process. But before we sort of jump to that, because one of the big things in that process is we're going to make sure we have to make sure we talk to that person pretty well in advance, and that they know when it's coming, and that it's not like, we don't want to end up sort of being blocked on some external person, and we don't want it to always be the same person. Ideally, it's sort of like switching around different platforms, different things, or that kind of thing. So yeah, I think it's, hey Rob, how you doing? Thank you for joining.
Sorry, I'm kind of late.
No worries at all. Say hello to the query team. Yeah, here, let me ship you, I'm going to paste you the hack pad that we're currently working from. But we are, where are we? We're just checking in. So like, I just quickly ran through the sort of format for this call, the way we're hoping to do it. Just hoping to do a very goal-oriented check-in on outstanding issues that are already in process. So the theory should be that a lot of these things should be defined in advance of the call, and that we would use this time just to check in on progress against the goal, and use this as a quick time to like sync against any issues that are coming up on that. And then the second half of the call, and ideally the call doesn't take the full hour, we just take as much time as we need. And the second half is reserved for some sort of discussion. That might be an RFC, that might be, and today actually we're going to discuss an RFC process, which I think is, we have this question about like, how do we do requests for comments around UX, which I think is like a really important thing to dig in on because we have to do a big UX refactor. So anyways, yeah, hopefully that's got you back up to speed. But the next bit I think we should check in on is our docs project. And so this is, long story short, our docs are abysmal. We really need to like I think it's one of our single biggest like long-term projects that we really haven't put a ton of work on. And when I say our docs are abysmal, it's not to like beat us up. I think, to be honest, like we've been trying to figure out what to make query, so like there's no point in documenting a thing that's in constant flux. But we're now getting people who are actually starting to like use the project and file issues, like the one they filed over the weekend, where it's like, hey, I found this tutorial on the internet and I ran this thing, and like, why didn't it work the way it did? Which to me is an indicator that people are now like using this for real stuff, and like they need clarifying documentation around how a lot of that should sort of look and feel and work, and they should be able to sort of self onboard themselves in the way that they're kind of already doing. But like I have this uneasy feeling that we should be doing better on that. So we set a goal this quarter of like trying to figure out how we're going to improve our docs, and then really use July 1 as our like chance to get a first pass on that improvement, and then see if we like that process, and then use the next quarter as a real like, by September we should be looking into like our docs should be less, I shouldn't be using the word abysmal. So with that, Dustin, you've been working on the doc run project. Do you want to sort of just give an update on that?
Sure, yeah. I would also say that I don't think our docs are abysmal per se, but there's definitely a lot of value that people have gained out of them, and like I even look at the docs now and then to like figure out what's going on sometimes. But the issue we keep running into is that things are in flux, things keep changing. The code is moving so fast that it's hard to even keep track of. Thanks, Rob. It's hard to keep track of where we even have to update things after some change gets made to an API or to some detail of how things work. So the idea behind DocRun is kind of inspired by literate programming. The idea is that we have markdown files everywhere in multiple places that talk about examples of how to do this or that. Sometimes these are Starlark snippets. Sometimes they're commands that are using query to do some task, like a example command line execution. And DocRun takes those, extracts them, plugs in a little bit of metadata also in the file, and then it can actually run those examples and see that they do what they are claiming to do. So it's basically a way of embedding unit tests into Markdown. The reason why we want to do this approach is that it makes it so that you're still naturally writing documentation and the examples are still in the place where it makes most sense to write them. It kind of reduces that tension of, oh, I don't know where to look even to like where to change this one particular written down fact. And DocRun has the capability to like look over all of our repos, kind of ties them all together, and then just kind of does the right thing for figuring out that our examples are still going to run correctly as they claim. So it'll also make it easier in the future to write even more tutorials. We can write further examples and add to that, scale it in the direction that we eventually want it to go. And DocRun will just run over all the new stuff too. So that'll be really super helpful. The status, right? Things got kind of busy at the end of last week. I wanted to have a runnable prototype by then, but it's pretty close at this point. Basically have all the infrastructure set up, just have to create Starlark and command line environments and then run the code that is being found by DocRun in our Markdown files. So I hope that by end of day today or early tomorrow at the latest, should have a working version of that. So yeah.
Cool. Can I ask some clarifying questions?
Totally.
So first, this is in terms of the types of documentation. We're talking mainly about tutorials, not about reference documentation. Is that right?
Yeah, super good point. Yeah. The kind of situation where you have DocGen filling a role where it is, extracting, say, function descriptions from code in comments and turning that into HTML. That's not what DocRun is trying to handle. It's trying to handle here's some pros talking about how you want to accomplish this task. Here's the query commands or Starlark code to accomplish that. And here's the result you should see. That's the thing that DocRun is really targeting.
Rob.
So how does DocRun handle a thing, I guess, that literate programming doesn't typically handle very well, which is in a lot of tutorials and stuff like this, you're going back and forth between editing a particular file or script or multiple and running commands or running bash scripts or other things and putting all those together, or does it not?
It has the ability to handle state between examples where the metadata that lives with the inline code can say to save part of the file, save part of the example code that you actually see in a file and append to it over time. So you could actually do the use case where you're here's this function and then that function, and those are actually get collected into a file. You can use that in later examples. So yeah, it does handle that. I
guess I mean more in a typical tutorial, you might have a script that you're writing, and then you need to have the example of running it. Then you run it with these args, in the command line, which is a totally different sort of environment from the script file. And literate programming is typically focused on I have this script and I'm annotating it, or even if you're going full on into it, you're reversing the relationship. I'm writing a document that's annotated with code. So it's focused on the one file.
Sorry, I'm not sure what you're asking.
Yeah, I guess I'm asking can it handle the situation where the document you're trying to get out at the end of the day isn't just about one file. It's about both a script that you're going to run on the command line, and it's about that file.
Right. So in other words, what's in the file and then what you do with it afterwards, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. No. So DocRun, it's designed so that you can switch between different layers of execution. So part of the metadata is also like, here's some Starlark code, and then here below that is like a shell command that like uses that. So it switches like, we get away with this because the system is very query specific. I'm not trying to write something like general right now. It's like a big fancy framework. It's just targeting our specific use cases that we run into, and maybe version 2 will be better about that. But for the current situation, it's kind of just like, what are the common use cases we keep seeing in our own documentation? How can we kind of wrap those up into nice little runnable functions? And it's basically like 2 separate cases right now of Starlark versus query commands.
Yeah, just to add some detail, our definition of success here is we want to see a red X when you write code that breaks docs. So we want our continuous integration systems to have some method of telling us when documentation has fallen out of sync because of changes to code. And that's something that we want. As a project, we found ourselves really like anything that we can get into the PR process gets done continually, right? If we sort of make it part of our procedure, it's a lot easier to make sure that it's maintained. And so we're going to be writing on this Docrun thing. We're going to write some like nice documentation on how Docrun works so that others can actually maintain the stuff, which is a little bit meta. But at first, I think this will start with, again, as Dustin's been saying, like pretty narrowly scoped. We think it's really important not to ship anything, any documentation that is out of date, which has been like a continual problem that as a project we can't maintain without some sort of tool to automate.
Yeah, step 1 is really to stem the bleeding, to make it so that we stop having broken examples in places.
Yeah. Cool. Anybody have any other questions on that? Okay, Sarika, good. Cool. All right, moving on. Yeah, and so then Dustin, you're back on deck. And so I think this is worth just chatting about our tooling and like how, just to sort of introduce this a little bit to give Dustin a little bit of framing. We're now at the point where like we need to be much more continually building and testing of the whole thing, all of query end to end, and having a much more simplistic, not simplistic. We need to better document and automate our tool process for building query cross-platform, and give those tools to others so that they are able to actually build the project or even cross-platform aspects of the project easier. So like a lot of this next part of this tooling is very aimed at the developer experience, making sure it's a little easier to sort of understand all the pieces that go into query. There's some funny seams because we took the multiple repository approach. I think this would have been a little easier if we went with the giant mono repo conversation. But we have our front end and our back end, and the two of those are sort of the 2 mainstay projects. And we really want to make sure that we keep everything in place, both from a testing perspective and from a building perspective. In order to build the front end, you need the back end. And in order to develop the front end, you need the back end. And so we've started into this project to hopefully do a lot of this sort of at the same time and introduce a central point of entry for getting the project sort of up and running on any machine in any context. And that's where some of our tooling stuff comes in. Dustin, hopefully I didn't take all of your thunder there. But with that, and Casey, you've been working on this too. So like, if you guys want to just speak to some of our work on this thing, Dustin, maybe starting with the kind of sort of long-term project, and then Casey, maybe I can get you to update on what we've been doing with query build, the CLI tool.
Yeah, sure. I know, I'm still kind of currently in the planning phase of like what query install, query build should be doing. I know Casey's been working more recently with the front end release and working on that stuff directly. But yeah, the idea is, the entry point to the query universe is going to be query install, and it's going to both be like, here's how we build a release to, push it out into the world. But also it can do things like, here's something that can run all of our unit tests across all of our repos so that we know, a change in one of our repos won't break things that depend on it. And something that's also building from head continually, because we currently aren't doing that. And there's been times people come into the project while we've changed one repo and not updated the callers, and things actually can't be built. So yeah, as more eyes are on the project, we want to make sure that everything is like stable and runnable all the time. Some other things are, once Docrun is working, it should be integrated into the continuous build. that should all be kind of like living in one place. That's basically like the overview of all of Query. So yeah, I hope like sometime this week, when Casey's around, we can like kind of share some of the knowledge between what's happening with Query Build, and I can understand more of that. I hope this week to have like a Windows executable start getting built that we can put out into future releases, because that'll be nuts. If we can have just like, a single exe someone can download and run on Windows, that's going to be pretty great. So yeah. Casey, you want to chat about what you've been doing there?
Sure. So I can talk a little bit about so our query install / query build tool, and how we're using it currently to write releases for the front end. And it does a bunch of like fun little things for all their different uses of the front end. You can build it as a web app, which also can then be, which when you run Query Connect and then you go to your local host, the right port, you get the Query front end app, with just Query. You don't actually have to download the whole Electron app. So it can build that version. It builds a read-only version of the web app, which we use on our app.query.io. And it builds the Query Electron app, which is part of what goes into our release. When we put out a release, the Electron app is like the main focus for that. So there's a bunch of, it's like a pretty, I don't know, customizables. I don't know if that's totally the right word, but there's a lot of different flags and like iterations you can do on the app for all the different things we do with it. And this tool lets us control all of that in a pretty simple, pretty straightforward way once you've gotten it set up.
Yeah, it's a command line tool, right?
Yeah, the command line tool.
Lovely. Yeah, and so to give some context to that project, we've been trying to do that just to sort of like externalize some of our process of actually like getting set up. We often find that like there's been just a little bit of voodoo and like, oh yeah, you just install this and build this and move it here or over there. And like ideally that would, the long term of this won't be anytime soon, but eventually it'd be really nice to have this like setup, dev environment setup wizard thing where it's just like, cool, what starts is just a readme set of instructions. Run this command, this command, this command. Now you have this, now you have that. And have like, we've had some like makefile stuff that checks to make sure that, eventually we'd like to say, hey, you require this version of Go, and like just making sure that everything is in the right place to avoid some of the pains of getting a new project on your machine. But yeah, cool. Very, very good. Any questions on that? Rob, does any of that sound good to you? Reasonable?
Makes sense to me. I mean, I don't really know the code base well enough to.
Yeah, totally. A lot of this is just like, hey, good practice-ish, sure. Yeah. This is, I think a lot of this is mainly addressing stuff that we're seeing internally. Like there's, as a query team, like I have a bunch of knowledge buried in my head, and then Casey and Dustin go to make something and they're like, okay, but how do you do that? And I'm like, well, let me write it down and tell you. And then a week goes by and nothing gets done. So we're just trying to use this as a chance to get a lot of that out the door. But yeah, okay. And so then I think this sort of gets us, I think that sort of wraps up a lot of their tooling stuff. Just at this point now, it's worth chatting about, okay, we're going to cut 0.8 sometime this week. Once we get our Go modules switch fixed and finished, which removing GX from our life is going to be a nice day. Not that GX is the worst, just having, it's nice. It's already, I'm seeing like some nice benefits out of the Go module stuff, and Casey and I have been going back and forth on it. Dustin, I'd love to make sure that you review at least one of those PRs, just so that you're up and up on like how you can edit the Go mod file to sort of like check out things. And there's some idiosyncrasies, basically because the libp2p project is now ahead of the IPFS project, and it's like important not to fast forward any of our libp2p dependencies, because we actually have to use Go IPFS's sort of like Go mod file as our main like source of truth. And then anything where we go past them is going to be questionable. Yeah, but there is some incredible stuff happening in libp2p. Like it's really nice to see this like libp2p core stuff coming out. The interfaces are getting cleaner and simpler, and the dependency trees are getting smaller. So I'm very excited about that. I'm looking forward to getting that into our code base. But a lot of this, once we get zero.io out of the door, that's like really, as we've been saying, like I think this sort of completes a first tour of all of the APIs we wanted to exist on the back end to be able to do everything we think we need to do in a data set version control system. You can create a data set, you can script its updates, you can then schedule those updates to be automated, and you can see a diff of what changed between the two. And that to me is like, great, we have a lot of the ingredients that we need. And so 2 major projects now kick off at the same time, refactoring the crap out of that code, cleaning it up, getting it tested, and this giant UX conversation that we could finally have around what does it mean to like work with query in a really concrete way. And so we've, as we know, we've had ColeJoin to sort of help flesh out some of the initial wireframes on how we could rethink some of that. And we've also like, we have a bunch of concrete use cases coming up where like we're prepping tutorials and workshops around very specific things that are helping us sort of like figure out, okay, cool, this is this person's problem. Does query actually solve that in a meaningful way? The thing I want to chat about is like, so we have this RFC process, which for us at Query has been really, 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 I think it's really helped our dev process. Feel free to correct me and others, but just the fact that you're forced to work out the way your API is going to work before you start writing code is like a really important thing. And to me, as a designer dev, it's always been, that part has been really clear on the dev side of the world, where it's like, cool, I'm going to write a document describing the kind of changes that I want to make. And that document kind of naturally expresses itself in sort of linear textual form. UX design, on the other hand, like we have tools like, we have a plethora of tools, a plethora of approaches, and a plethora of platforms. And there's just like, it kind of explodes in every direction. And then trying to facilitate and gather outside feedback around that, and then report back on outside feedback around that is really tough. And this time so I think we really want to entertain, what does it look like to have some sort of review process, particularly an externalizable, if not external. I mean, I'd love to have this just be external from the get-go. But like, how do we do that? And some things to just like start throwing on the table, like we'd use Sketch a lot internally as like our UI wireframing tool. There are projects like Zeppelin, there's projects like InVision that lets you sort of like do some of this stuff and gather feedback. I don't know if any of them are open source, but what does this process look like? How does this affect our timetables, making sure that we can actually ship code in a meaningful amount of time? And just to like finally say that often the way we've dealt with this is just like scheduling meetings with specific people and saying, I want to show you this and get your feedback on it. And I think that that's probably got to work in there somewhere, right? That's what we've been doing right now. And so, yeah. Anybody have any thoughts?
I'm excited for this all to be working. That's about it.
Yeah, but I mean, you can see how it's super complicated, right? Like we have this new concept of like a feed kind of coming in, and like, what does that mean? And like, we want to make that completely tunable. What does that mean? Like, I think there's like a push-pull on the feature side of things where like, I think devs should get a chance to weigh in on, wait a second, that's going to be a whole bunch of new work. But at the same time, we really want to make sure that like the sort of central goal here is a bunch of people want to see themselves in the project. Casey.
I have a question specifically for you on what you were doing with we had talked about internally. I don't know if we've ever talked about this outside of just us, about using pulling not focused front end app when you're trying to basically creating a new little project when you're trying to like work out what some features might look like. And I wanted to know your opinion about how that was going on your first dive into diff, if you like what you thought about it, if it's something that as we move forward for like this feed stuff, if you would want to go in that direction when we're looking for this like update UI stuff. Just my question about your opinion and how that's worked out for you.
Totally. Yeah, and I think it's like, first and foremost, it like kind of failed, right? Like it sort of started as just, so to bring some clarity, we thought we would do, one of our goals for this quarter was we're eventually working on a data set pull request, right? Like that's where we want to end, with this capacity to say, person who doesn't run this data set, would like to modify your data set, and how do I like make that request? How do you have the discussion around that change? And how do you have like, and this is the definition of turning data work into a two-way conversation, right? And so our goal this quarter was just to build a diff viewer. And we thought, okay, cool. The diff viewer is going to be complicated enough that we should set that up as just like a separate project, and use create React app as this like sort of template stub thing that would let us like dial into a very specific part of the query API, and it would just like basically only do one thing. But any of that like sort of stub code might be able to be sort of upgraded into something that's actually production quality. When I went to start the project, I have a branch right now in process that is like a diff viewer, and we've been working a bunch on like how to do diff viewers with our structural differ, and that one ended up being so complicated that it was almost easier to like, I needed so many off-the-shelf components that it was really hard to do. And I think that by off-the-shelf components, I mean components that are already in our code base. Like I've come to rely on like our list component. I've come to rely on our button components. And like, it just seemed like too much work to pull that into a separate thing. So I think I want to stay like sort of zoomed out and like not so code specific here, but I think as like a first glance, if our component library was expressed as a package that you could actually pull from, it would be easier to do. If it was something that I could npm install, that would give it a chance in hell of being like useful. But that's a lot of work. And before we go do that, I think the other thing to ask here is like, we're kind of talking about wireframes, and like building code to test a user experience is like that's a really heavy lift just to find out whether a certain flow works. The other thing we've been experimenting with is this React Storybook stuff, right? Like just being able to sort of like build out really quick stories. What I've yet to understand is like, are those stories sort of like a kind of smoke test that allow you to feed funny state to a component and see how it behaves? Or is it actually a UX like flow? Is it like sophisticated enough to be able to do that without such an onerous amount of programming? I think it's useful either way, just because being able to like test state and like have a story around this is a list of data sets, and like have that in an isolated situation is like wildly useful. But I think that's sort of like another conversation. But yeah, so initially, I don't know. I think it didn't work out so well. It didn't work out as well as expected. Yeah, it's just like more repos. I think the other issue was like, when I went to do it, I was like, do I need to create a new repository so that we can then have this conversation, and then the issues around that like go, where does that go? I don't know. That bit also felt a little icky and weird. I don't know. What do you think, Case?
No, it's sort of interesting. I'm trying to think of one, like, would it work if we didn't? Would it work more in like a wireframing-y way? Like we just throw things on and say, okay, well, there would be a button that does this, and when you click it, it shows, but we don't care about what it looks like. Or is it better to just use software that's for wireframing to do that instead of having to, like, I don't know. I think it's still a conversation. Like, interested to hear your experience about it. So.
Yeah, totally. I think we should do both, and I think we're better. I think we tend to swing the code hammer a lot, and so I think it's easier. I think it's easier for us to get to that like code spike side of things. I'm more concerned about like picking a tool for wireframing and like actually having that wireframing system in like drive our process of before we start writing code. And that's that relationship between RFC and like pull requests that I really want to see us stick to, and really, because the RFCs are now set so that somebody else could write one, right? Like it doesn't need to be somebody that is officially working on the project to come in and say, I've used this, I have had this frustrating experience, and I care enough to like come in and say something, or I'm not frustrated, I can see some great way in which query can work better, and I'd like to propose that change, and not have that person like not know, and just make sure that there's an explicit place where that can happen. And I really want to make sure that there's an explicit place where someone can give us feedback on the way that the app actually clicks and functions and works. So I think we do need something resembling front-end RFCs, but like, I'm reticent to like pick a tool, but maybe we just do. Like, we've used InVision in the past. I don't think we were wildly into it. Zeppelin came up a bunch at Data Together, and Edgy. Ray Cha used Zeppelin a bunch. And so that was like, I don't think we got a ton out of that, but maybe some of that is just like, I think we need to commit to like really trying it, and like the same way we did with the RFCs, where it was like the first, you guys remember the first like 7 or 8 of those were just brutal. It was so painful to like sit down and like commit to writing that, like that historical stuff. I don't know. Should we just pick one and try it? I'm leading this conversation a little heavily, but
Sure.
Yeah, it's hard because I haven't done any research into knowing, like I don't have an opinion about, I can't help you right now in having an opinion about what tool to use, because, you know, maybe on the table is like research tools and see if they seem better than what our current workflow is.
I like that a lot. I think that's what we should do first. Just like file an issue on front end on a bunch of possible tools for wireframing. And then there's a chance in hell that someone else could come in and say, yeah, this is a good idea. Let's post that to the Discord. But then let's pick one and wireframe everything and explicitly tell everybody, if you're interested in giving feedback on this, you can do it here. And if nobody does it, don't care. Like we will keep moving forward with it. And I think it's just really, to me, it's pretty important that we get in that habit. I think it's particularly hard to do with UX. I've seen some front-end projects that actually include an assets folder that includes like PSD mockups of stuff so that you can actually modify the assets as they're going. I'm a little concerned about repo bloat. Like I think that like really drives the size of a repo up. And so it works well for like icons and things that are tinier or vector images, but it also means that you need a copy of Photoshop, and then like have this whole conversation there. So yeah. Okay, so I think we should just file an issue around that and call that a day, and we'll get rocking and rolling on this, and hopefully in 2 weeks we have some like cool new wires of at least some experiences to show. And we'll be sort of like working off that. Yeah. Anyone have any thoughts on that before we move on? Who wants to file the issue? I guess I will. Yeah, I've been bullying this conversation. I'll file the issue. But yeah, cool. So last but not least, just wanted to leave like a little space for like, actually specifically to Rob. Like, do you think there's anything that wasn't covered on this call that you were hoping to get more info on? Or are you just kind of checking in?
Well, I wasn't really 100% sure what to expect. I think from the way you described it before, I thought it was going to be more like overview of internals, which was not what this is, but that's totally fine. Like, I don't know that I walked in with like I want this out of this call. So I feel like on the other one, it was more of an engaged community call, and this is more of me just being a fly on the wall, but that's also because this one is pretty much all query folks except me.
It's just, yeah, absolutely. And thank you for joining it. It officially makes it a more open thing. But yeah, we just decided like, let's do the call anyways, right? Like we should just get in the habit of, and this is just, we're just using this as our actual sync time. There's no difference. Yeah, cool. I think we, on the like, in the future, we will like, ideally, my hope is that someone will put an RFC up and we'll say, cool, we want to work through this. And that will require diving into the guts. This one, I mean, it's just like, we're talking about wireframe questions, and it's more of a procedural problem than it is an actual technical one. But my hope is in future calls, we'll like by necessity of discussing a change to something, we'll have to sort of lay out some of the pieces on the table and be like, cool, this is how this works, this is how this works. Yeah, I do have a quick update on, speaking of like a sticky change. So we have this IPFS camp thing coming up, and we've been having this major league problem pinning stuff to our gateway IPFS node. So I think I know the real reason for this. It's because we work at WeWork, and WeWork has this giant router, and then we have a router behind that router. And so there's just like no way to get clear communication. Because Case, you went back to your place and you had like a way better,
Yeah, it just worked. It was fine.
Yeah. So, but we have this like ace in the hole trick with this desync package that works really, which makes this not a problem when query is functioning. The problem is right now it's over HTTP, not over libp2p, which means that it effectively can't work on raw IPFS. And it's also like you need to be running query to do it. And to do desync, we're eventually going to be pinning to an IPFS cluster instance, not to a query instance, for our actual like large scale availability of DAGs. So I started into a refactoring of desync, first just to bring in Go modules, but second to clean up that API. Because we talked a while ago about having it just be oriented around push and pull. And instead of, this is a conversation from like 6 weeks ago. Right now it's like request send, request receive, and it's like, and there's like receivers and receive, and which is actually just state around a transfer. So yeah, I've started into a refactor of that. I think it'll be really straightforward to like write a libp2p version of desync. But first I want to break the API and make it more clear. Just like wrap it into one single thing. It's like you create a new desync, which you can give it a libp2p host, or just like, and then also sew in that like check function that we've been talking about, which is just a interface that lets you say, cool, run this function and pass the like template of what this person wants to push to you, including their PRID and any sort of like a somewhat opaque metadata block. In query land, that'll set us up to later do a Starlark script. Just say, cool, run this Starlark script with it if it exists. But when we're running as an IPFS plugin, I think that's really, really close and really easy to do. I just read through the plugin syntax. It's like not going to be that hard because we're already written around those interfaces. But we can also just accept like a whitelist of profile IDs that you will accept data from, which will mean we can install this plugin on our box in Kubernetes, and then whitelist all of our own profile IDs, pure IDs. And then that will let us push over desync, and it'll kill this router problem. This is like, go ahead.
Two things. One, make sure this refactoring doesn't break how remotes work, because they're also using desync and receivers in a different way than the other clients. And the second part, is that whitelisting thing you just mentioned, is that going to interact with how remotes do acceptance of pushes?
No, only because it'll be a completely different context. Basically, both of them will accept a function that says this is the function that if it returns false, then I'm not to accept it. And then it's bring your own like security, basically.
Okay.
It's just the plugin needs some sort of security, and like obviously Go IPFS doesn't have a Starlark execution environment, so let's just give it a JSON file of people it'll accept DAGs from and call that a day. But this will skip because like we've been getting a lot of mileage out of skipping BitSwap, and I think we just need to like, it'll also be a really nice thing to bring to IPFS camp is like, hey, cool, let's talk about P2P and let's talk about how we're able to get this really fast syncing, and you can have it too, and you don't need to be using query to do it. And so I think it's sort of like a double whammy of like, this is something we can get back to the community if they want it. It can be structured as a plugin, so you don't need to be like inside of our code base or ecosystem to use it. But also just like, it'll work for us and sets us up for down the future. And I have been looking at very carefully at the remotes code inside of query to make sure that I'm going to break the interfaces, but I'll submit a follow-up PR that cleans them up. Yeah. Have we told you about desync, Rob? I think I've told you about it in the past. No?
If you did, I have forgotten.
It's all good. Yeah, we've sort of like come to the theory, like we want, so the huge problem with query is data sets can be unbounded in size. So you can have like a many gigabyte data set and you just want to get the metadata, right? You just want the blocks that explain what's the title, what's the, and then you eventually want to be able to progressively stream the blocks in the body so that when you're on the front end looking at data, you're not transferring entire Merkle bags to just see and do a quick browsing experience. So we developed this, we have this whole package suite called just DAG, which is all of our sort of like graph tools. And this is mainly built on top of the IPLD interfaces, but skipping around a lot of IPLD. Query is still just a Unix FS v1 project through and through. But what this introduces, DAG brings a couple of like primitives that we've been using at Query. We have a DAG info, which is that, oh, Q, yeah, sorry, thank you, Dustin. I forgot an I. Yeah, we don't have any private repos. But yeah, what was I gonna say? So we introduced this notion of a manifest, which basically just like gives you a digest of a graph and lets you ship that around and say, cool, these are all of the content identifiers and these are all the links between that. And we ship that as, so that's a manifest, and then you build an info on top of that. And infos are more subjective, which allows you to label parts of the graph that you think are interesting or useful. And so you can say, cool, this block is actually the root of metadata.json, and like that'll contain and will give you a way to say, cool, I only need these blocks or only need those blocks. But the framework is, it lets you annotate that in whatever way you want. So desync is basically just rsync, but with DAG blocks. And we use those manifests to do coordination around, hey, I want to send you this thing. Here's a manifest of what I want to send you. I check my list of local blocks and I hand you back a manifest of the difference. And then it says, cool, I need to send you these like that subset of blocks in parallel. And that's effectively how push works in query. And we currently do that by taking those blocks, encoding them over HTTP, and then using the block API to jam them into the local repo. And then at the end, we follow that up with a pin request, which allows us to completely skip around the bit swap and instead just do point-to-point transfer, which we get much more consistent performance out of. And that's how, when I've been saying in other calls that like we can do, you can use query without ever going on the DWeb. That's why. It's because you can just do everything around over HTTP, which moves the blocks. And so you don't actually have to run query connect, which spins up your peer-to-peer system because it's not happening in peer-to-peer, it's just over HTTP.
I have a couple questions about that, if you don't mind.
Totally.
So the first thing is that info thing, then is that like a DAG node on IPFS, or is it also just a file, like a Unix FS node?
So the actual info is part of a communication protocol. So the manifest and the info itself are communication objects. They can be persisted. The reason we split the manifest and the info is we want the manifest to be verifiable because it's a derived Merkle proof, because it's a application of a uniform function to a immutable resource. The DAG info is subjective, right? Like the author of the info may choose to label things differently, and that will introduce a degree of complexity and doesn't have the same trust qualities that we have. But in both contexts, they are currently the only way we use them is just as an abbreviated communication technique. Hey, here's a manifest of what I want to send you. You don't need to persist this. Just these are the blocks, and it goes cool. And then as it's getting the blocks on the other side, it's checking as they come in, going, okay, you gave me this list and everything should line up, and you said these links would be here, here, and here. And if you ever lied to me, I'd just fail. So we're just relying on the raw Merkle proof for that. Eventually, though, we'd like to use the Merkle. We'd like to cache both of them and keep them as blocks. Maybe IPLD objects. I don't know. Many conversations to be had about IPLD, but yeah. Does that answer your question?
I think mostly. It might just be that I'm a little bit confused on the difference or where things live or sit or how they exist between the manifest and the info. I didn't quite get that when you were originally saying that those are separate things.
Totally. So the manifest is just two things. It's the one list of all of the content identifiers, though, like the full DAG in a flat list. and then a list of the links between those based on the position of the nodes. And so it's a very compact expression of a DAG. And so instead of like, you know how every hash is like how many characters, we'll only list those once in a manifest, and then we use the indices of that array to draw the links. And so it's just 0 to 1, 1 to 2. And so that thing is the concrete thing. And so it includes no information that you can't derive directly from the DAG itself. Basically, it's just an expression of the structure of the graph, not any of its content. And then the info stuff, you can include, info includes some other like more, like it's modeled after OS file info, which is like, how big is this file? Is it a file or a directory? Like, you know, more stuff that, because like you can actually, we've seen some security stuff in DAGs where you can actually lie about sizes and create weird offsets and stuff. So again, this just like becomes sort of like not secure conversation. And so you need to have a different kind of trust if you're going to talk about DAG infos. But DAG manifests you can verify in a number of ways. And that's why we drew a separation between the two. Just basically the stuff that you can know and the stuff that you're going to have to really check or trust the person you're hearing from. Does that help?
Yeah, that makes sense. The other thing I was curious about, so when you say you're not necessarily doing any DWeb stuff at all with desync and talking over HTTP, so in that case, are you talking to like a particular HTTP server or set of servers? It's not like a libp2p HTTP transport and you've just figured out at runtime like which host you're talking to.
Exactly. And so that's currently the state of the world. Dustin's written a bunch of stuff around. I can set up an HTTP remote, and which means I have to actually have access to the static IP address and serve there. And so what we're now talking about is doing that exact same process over libp2p, where we can dynamically say, just send this point to point from pure A to pure B using libp2p transports instead of HTTP transports. Yeah, that's it. The nice thing about manifests is they work a lot like BitTorrent torrent magnet files, which gives you the capacity to now, the thing that you have that you didn't have in the BitSwap context is the laundry list of what or the grocery list of what you need to build the DAG, right? And so now I can take that list, I can get that, and I can cut that list in half and say, both Casey and Dustin have the DAG that I'm after. I can ask them I can properly parallelize the work and say, cool, can you give me the blocks that correspond with the top half of the list of DAG nodes? And then Casey, can you give me the net blocks that correspond with the bottom half of the list? And then as those are finishing, I can do fancy stuff to juggle. But it gives me a technique to parallelize. But first you need to get into we're not doing any of that right now. Right now, the only thing we use it for is just point to point. But eventually we can do cool stuff like that.
Do you have concerns about or plans for, like, since it sounds like part of the point of this was to have a smaller, faster way to get the metadata and plan who you're going to ask for what, like when it gets so big that it's no longer like feasibly small to basically map the entire tree of an object?
Yeah, so there's a really nice property here where the manifest itself has a corresponding relationship to the size of the DAG, right? So if it's a 25 gig DAG, then it will span across blocks, but it's still, I think it's like more than 2,000 times smaller than the thing that you're trying to download, right? And so the manifest is still valuable even in those really large multi-block spanning contexts. And so it's, even if it's a megabyte of DAG data, as far as we can tell, if you express the DAG manifest as CBOR, you can do like 5 gigs, no, 2 gigs of data in like less than 100 kilobytes of manifest. So it's an extremely, like, it's a nice relationship where you have like pretty small. And so like you'd have to be getting into the like, 20, 30 gig DAG before you're actually dealing in a manifest that would span across the 256 kilobyte block boundary.
Right. Okay. So you have a lot of headroom, but you'll have problems when, like, say you're trying to model like Landsat.
Yes, 100%. But I think it's a nice primitive just based on that relationship. And we absolutely will have to cross that bridge when we get to it, where you now have like a 2 megabyte 5 megabyte manifest. And it's just like, oh, okay. and the DAG info will actually bloat that a bunch too, right? Like if you start including a list of sizes, like that's a non-trivial list, and you now have to like think about that. But I think the thing that I'm really convinced about is that it gives us a lot of room to grow, and it gives us a way to now start talking about where I think the IPFS project has been having a lot of conversations about graph sync and like how do we deal with this problem of partial graphs. I think we have a much better primitive in the form of manifest to be able to say, let's all the peers that are going to do distributed computation should have the manifest, and now they have the information they need, or actually in this case the DAG info. Now they have the information they need to do distributed processing, because we've labeled, oh, I'm supposed to be processing on rows 1 to 10,000. That's these blocks, and I need to make sure I have these blocks before I agree to do anything. Or I have agreed to keep only part of this massive Landsat DAG. This is the part that I've agreed to keep, and others can sort of coordinate on subdivisions of a large graph. So we'll see, but so far so good. Does that help? Cool, we managed to land a deep dive on a technical issue. But yeah, I think it's 3 o'clock, and so let's not take up anybody else's time if we can avoid it. But thank you so much, Rob, for joining us. It's really nice to have you on the call. It's very cool. And I know we have a few others, like some people who are working on open source contributions to our Storybook stuff. We're excited to join, so maybe we'll get them next time. But yeah, very cool. Any closing thoughts, anybody? No? Okay, awesome. All right, well then I think we should call it a day. Thank you so much.
Cool. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.